Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Rozelle. I'm the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. And we are proud to host the Hayden Center and to put on these wonderful events that we put on throughout the academic calendar year. I'm absolutely delighted to see that people are coming back in person. It's coming back pretty well now. Before I was just telling some folks before the pandemic, we would fill this place up and we would go to overflow locations that we were drawing such large crowds for these events. But we have a couple hundred people or more already signed up online doing the live stream as well. So we do have a pretty substantial audience here this evening. So we've built actually quite a good following for our virtual events, several hundred or more each time. But we decided it's time to come back and to be doing these programs in person. Now, for the live stream, though, we have people signed up tonight from 29 states and the District of Columbia and 29 countries on every continent except one. You can probably guess which one. But again, nothing beats seeing all of you here. And I know that many of you are Hayden Center regulars, but for those who are new to these events, this center was founded 5 years ago by former NSA and CIA Director, Schar School Professor Michael V. Hayden, who is here with us tonight. And like the Schar School generally, the center is nonpartisan and plays an important role in elevating our understanding of key subject areas in public policy and government. With what is happening in the news lately, it's an understatement to say that there's a critical need to communicate the role of the importance of intelligence to the national security and do so in a way that stands outside the typical hyperpolarization of much of the political debate and discussion that goes on in our country these days. The Hayden Center has been a very prominent voice in explaining and demystifying intelligence and security issues. So if you've missed some of our past programs, we have all of them on the Hayden Center website and on our YouTube channel. We've got some great ones there, so please poke around, take a look at some of those programs in the past. And related to the Hayden Center, we have a variety of other high-impact research and public-facing centers at the Schar School, including a center on security policy studies, which is very focused on the student experience within George Mason University. And our graduate program in security studies has been top 10 rated nationally 5 years in a row by U.S. News and World Report. And I'm very pleased to report as well that we inaugurate next fall a new undergraduate degree program in international security and law, which will be the first of its kind. So again, thank you for attending. I hope to see you at our many future events here in Arlington or online if you can't make it. And with that, I would like to introduce the director of the Hayden Center, my colleague Larry Pfeiffer, who will now introduce tonight's program. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for turning out. I know there's a lot of competition in the Washington area for this hour of the day, so appreciate you all coming here. And for those who are sitting at home drinking a beer or petting the dog while you're watching us, thank you for attending as well. As Mark suggested there, the Hayden Center was established to put a spotlight on intelligence and the role it plays in supporting policymakers, and we do that through these events like we're having tonight. If you'd like to know more about our events, want to be the first to know about an event, go to our webpage, haydencenter.gmu.edu, and put your email address in the box over on the right-hand side of the screen, and you'll be getting emails from us talking about the events and when they're scheduled. Excuse me. Our event is being live streamed on YouTube. It's being recorded to be put on our YouTube channel and our social media. We're also recording the audio tonight to have it serve as the basis for a Lawfare podcast. Is it the Chatter podcast?
It'll be Lawfare.
The Lawfare podcast. So that'll open up the Hayden Center experience to a lot more people. So thank David Priess for that. We are out on social media. We've got Twitter accounts, LinkedIn accounts, Facebook accounts. We've got spots on Mastodon and Post in case there's a post-Twitter world we have to operate in soon. So check us out there. We tend to not only put information about our events, but information that's of an intel and national security interest. A nice one-stop shop for that kind of material. Tonight, we're going to have a great conversation, and at a certain point, we're going to have time for audience questions. So be thinking about all the great questions that you want to ask our esteemed panel members here. When you do have time to ask for a question, David will let you know when it happens. You're going to line up at these microphone stands on the two sides over here, and David will call on you alternating sides. And when you get up there, we'd really love it if you tell us who you are. If you've got an affiliation you're proud of, tell us that affiliation. If you're a member of the press, we'd really love you to tell us you're a member of the press. Thank you. And then please put your statement in the form of a question. Try to avoid speechifying so that we can let people behind you in line get to their question as well. For our virtual audience, we welcome your questions as well. You're watching on YouTube, so there's a live chat function that you should hit the live chat button next to the screen, and you can poke your questions in there. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll ask a question or two from YouTube as well. Following the event, for those of you here in person, we're going to have a reception in the multipurpose room just across the lobby. There'll be food, there'll be beverages of all kinds of variety. We would love you to come and spend some time, network with your fellow audience members, and perhaps have a chance to talk to our guests and our moderator as well. So tonight, what are we looking at? We're looking at actually counterintelligence. And what is counterintelligence? Well, counterintelligence is the myriad efforts undertaken by our government to protect the nation against intelligence and security threats from foreign governments and other foreign entities. This is a 24/7 job against relentless adversaries, but also against persistent friends. It can cover the waterfront from threats to national security, the theft of intellectual property, attempts to suppress the freedom of immigrants, attempts to sway state and local officials as they're beginning to enter their government life. So we're going to hear about that. We're going to hear about a lot more tonight. Specifically, we're going to hear from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, or NCSC, one of the national centers at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And we'll be hearing from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Counterintelligence Division. These are two of several critical elements involved in this fight. Our moderator for tonight is David Priess, who's familiar to many of you. He's the publisher and chief operating officer at Lawfare and the Lawfare Institute, which is the online and podcast source of national security information and insight. He is at Lawfare the co-host of Chatter, a new podcast that he does with Shane Harris of the Washington Post. So please check out Lawfare online, check out the Lawfare podcast, and definitely subscribe and follow David's Chatter podcast. I spent a bit of time driving to and from Florida last week, and I listened to several of his podcasts, so I can attest that they're all very good, and they kept me awake. David has also served in the intel community. He was an analyst from CIA who served as a briefer to senior officials of our government. Once he left government, he wrote a book called The Book of Secrets, which looks at the history of the President's daily intelligence briefing. It is the definitive open source document on that process. So if you've not read it, I encourage you to hop on Amazon and order that book and take a look at it. He serves as a senior fellow here at the Hayden Center and has been a visiting professor at the Schar School. Representing the work of counterintelligence tonight, we have two wonderful guests, and thank them ahead of time for coming. We have Mirriam-Grace. She is the executive director of NCSC, currently the number 2 position there. Before this position, from 2021 to 2023, she served at the White House as the director for counterintelligence at the National Security Council, where she led development of counterintel policy for the Biden-Harris administration. For 5 years before that, she was at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and served in a series of positions, including the National Counterintelligence Officer for Russia, Europe, and Eurasia, as the Deputy National Intelligence Manager for Counterintelligence, which interestingly included work on supporting Operation Warp Speed, the vaccine development effort, helping to raise threat awareness for state, local, and private sectors regarding foreign intelligence services trying to get their arms around the great development work we were doing. Her career started at DIA, where she spent 11 years working a variety of subjects, including counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and other counter-espionage issues. Alan Kohler is here from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Since the spring of 2020, he has been the assistant director running the Counterintelligence Division. In 2019, he was the senior agent in charge of the Counterintelligence Division at the Washington Field Office. In 2018, he was at the CI Division at the headquarters again as the Deputy Assistant Director. This guy moved around a lot in recent years. 2017, Chief of the Eurasia Section of the CI Division. 2016, the Assistant Senior Agent in charge for counterterrorism, intelligence, and crisis management at the Norfolk Field Office. And in 2012, he spent a few years serving as the Assistant Legal Attaché in London, and I'm sure there's some fascinating stories about your time in London. Prior stints included time in the New York Field Office and the Washington Field Office, which is where he was when the Pentagon was struck on 9/11, and he was involved in the evidence response team at the Pentagon at that time. Prior to joining the FBI in 1996, he worked in the private sector, managing engineering research at a private firm, and just goes to show you that you can be an FBI agent even if you have a degree in, is it ceramics engineering? Yeah,
Ceramic engineering, yeah.
Ceramics engineering. So the intel community, the law enforcement community, they take people with all kinds of backgrounds. So with that, welcome, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate that. I'm going to double down on something Larry said. It's very rare, perhaps unique, to have two senior representatives on counterintelligence speaking publicly about what counterintelligence is and what's happening in the threat environment. It's one of the most sensitive areas of the general intelligence world. Because of that, there's going to be a whole lot of things that can't be discussed here in terms of specific threats that are ongoing right now. That's the nature of the game. And our guests are going to have a fairly narrow channel to navigate to inform and educate without revealing anything that should not be revealed. That also applies to your questions. You'll get a sense over the next 45 minutes or so the kinds of things that we can talk about. And this will be one of those cases where, as you line up for questions and you think of questions, if it's a question that sounds wildly different than the kind of thing that's been coming up, you might want to think about whether that is something that can be discussed here. If it's not related to counterintelligence, we're not going to talk about it, so don't bring your political partisan questions. And if it is something very specific on a current counterintelligence threat, such as an active investigation that you've heard about, not a good question to ask, because I'm probably going to politely move to the next questioner at that point. So with that as a caveat, welcome to this joint event of the Hayden Center and of Lawfare for the Lawfare podcast. I'll start with you, Mirriam. First of all, thank you for making time to be here.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Busy day as always.
Yes.
You are from an organization that, in my experience, even people working within the US government for quite some time often don't know about. The National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Give us the background brief. What is it, and why was it created when we already had the FBI and other entities working on counterintelligence over so many years?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there are a lot of people that don't know what the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, NCSC for short, does. NCSC is responsible for leading and supporting the U.S. government's counterintelligence and security activities. It is a component of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and it was previously, years ago, another organization called the Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. So in our work to lead and support the counterintelligence and security activities of the U.S. government, we do a number of things. I think the best way to describe the work we do is it's really to integrate the counterintelligence activities of different counterintelligence components of the U.S. government so that we're working towards a common goal. Some of this you might see in the national CI strategy. So how do we bring all of the activities that the CI community has and the authorities that they have together in a way that helps us achieve these objectives? We also have an important outreach function. So part of our outreach is Congress has mandated that we do outreach to private sector entities that are at risk of being targeted by foreign intelligence services. We also issue public warnings on foreign intelligence threats, and some of this space we have done jointly with FBI, of course, but that is one aspect of our mission set.
I would say back in the old days, and it's up to you to decide how long ago the old days were, the kind of outreach you would think about in terms of counterintelligence was somebody like Alan showing up at your company saying, you have a problem. We're here to tell you that there's been a compromise or there's been an issue. And it sounds like you're trying to get ahead of that. You're trying to talk to people before there's a problem to help prevent it from happening in the first place.
That's right. We are trying to get ahead of it. So one of the ways we think about this is to look at the counterintelligence landscape, to look at how the targets that the foreign intelligence services are focused on. I mean, we see, for example, that they are targeting every sector of our economy. So much of our outreach thus far has been to industry. We also see them targeting state and local government leaders, and so we've done outreach in that space as well. And really, it is to get a greater understanding at those levels of how foreign intelligence services operate, what kind of information they might want, and what mitigations those organizations or state and local levels might be able to put in place as they move forward in their engagements, potentially with some of these foreign intel services.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to drill down on a couple of those aspects as we go on in the conversation. Sure. But Alan, let's bring you in. With this overview, this integrating function of the ODNI in the entity of NCSC. FBI has been doing counterintelligence for a very long time. How do you fit into that structure, and what specifically does the FBI do within its slice of counterintelligence?
Yeah, good question. First of all, thank you for having me here. And when you were talking about back in the good old days, I feel like I've been around long enough that I actually lived in the good old black and white days, you know? There was a time not too long ago, so I got in the Bureau in '96. There was a time not too long ago where we wouldn't say Russia, China, or Iran out loud, and we would sort of obliquely talk about threats from foreign adversaries or national security threat countries. And what we've realized is that just didn't answer the mail for our constituents. You know, people need to know what the threats were, who they're coming from, what the vectors are. So we have changed our posture greatly, particularly in the last 5 years, but really in the time since maybe 2000, when we're trying to be more forward-leaning and sharing information, doing events like this to talk about the threats and then how people can engage with the FBI.
What do you think spurred that change the most? Was that more of an external environmental thing, or internal leadership saying, we just need to get ahead of this more?
So I think it was a reflection, if we talk about how the threats have morphed. When I got into the FBI working counterintelligence in '96, I was a baby agent in the Washington field office, and I spent most of my time, frankly, chasing Russian intelligence officers around the streets of Washington. And we were very focused on watching people in buildings who were trying to steal US government secrets. And then the Economic Espionage Act was passed in 1996. And there's a realization, probably took us too long to realize it, that, hey, the real secrets that our adversaries want are not necessarily the US government classified secrets. It's not what I have in my safe. It's what's in the heads of the engineers that work for IBM and Apple and Intel. It's what is in the computer drives of these companies. Those are the pieces of information that drive our economy and keep our national security going, and that's what our adversaries are targeting. So the only way that we could really, people inside the government sort of understood that we were targets. The only way to get people in industry and in academia to understand that they were targets and we needed to work together to protect everything was to just be more open about it. And we're still learning, we're still evolving how we talk about the threats and how much we share. But we're light years ahead of where we were even 10 years ago.
This event would not have happened in this fashion even 10 years ago.
It would not, no.
No. Let's talk about a few of those threats, and in the course of doing so, we'll hit some of the things you've mentioned about some of the things that are different now than they would have been a decade or more before. Let's start with what has been publicly identified by people in the counterintelligence community as the premier threat, China, the People's Republic of China. Talk about the threat overall. Mirriam, I'll start with you. Kind of how do you characterize the overall threat, especially how diverse and wide-ranging it is in a way that in some ways the old Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia wasn't? Why is the PRC such a, I would say, unique threat in American history from a counterintelligence point of view?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a unique threat because it poses both a national security and an economic security threat to the United States. They are an incredibly capable intelligence actor, one that poses or presents really the broadest and most persistent cyber espionage threat to US government networks, as well as to US private sector networks. And that's deeply concerning. They are involved in foreign malign influence activities to advance both their political, economic, and security goals. And they are really on the cutting edge of pushing our technological competitiveness. So we've seen, for example, in Made in China 2025, as they rolled out this plan, this effort on their part to achieve self-sufficiency in key technology areas. That, along with the 5-year plan that they rolled out in 2021, which highlighted key technology areas where they wanted to surpass the United States. This has really driven the intelligence collection and targeting of these sectors by the Chinese intelligence services. So I think that's why it's incredibly unique.
Yeah, I would just add to that as Mirriam said, with the Made in 2025 plans or Made in China 2025, the 5-year plans, China has a 100-year plan to essentially be the only superpower in the world. Mm-hmm. And their goal is to outpace us, and they're going to do it any way they can. And they're doing it on a scale that is almost incomprehensible to the average person when you think about how many people China has, but how much resource they put towards their intelligence apparatus and their talent development. It's incredible. And their effort against the United States is easily much larger than all other countries combined. And they have the money and the industry that can take advantage of the information they're stealing from us in a way that no other country can do.
The way you've described that, it goes back to what you started with, Mirriam, which is the NCSC trying to coordinate and integrate all of this. This sounds like a much wider, almost whole of government approach for the United States than it used to be in counterintelligence, where it was isolated to a few 3-letter agencies. But now what you've just described, you of course have to have DOD and the Department of State involved and the intelligence community. You have to have the Department of Commerce involved. You have to have the Department of Agriculture involved. You have to have just about everybody involved at some point because of the wide nature of the threat. How do you go about integrating all of that when even the ODNI itself is usually restricted to those 17 or 18 agencies and not all of these agencies and departments across the government?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because some of those agencies or those departments that you've mentioned are not part of the U.S. intelligence community, and that makes it challenging. Let me hit on your first point about this being a whole of government effort. I think, when we think about the threat from China, they are employing a very broad effort against the United States, right? They use a lot of different types of collectors, not just, the traditional collectors working out of a Chinese embassy, but a range of non-traditional collectors that they're using to target this information. And so I think because we're seeing the threat landscape change so widely, that really drives greater cooperation and collaboration across the interagency to include at those departments that are not part of the intelligence community. So to get to your question on how we do that, we have great partnerships. We at NCSC, one of the things we do actually also run is the National Insider Threat Task Force, and that incorporates a lot of the work the non-Title 50s, which is shorthand for non-IC agencies, participate in. That allows us to engage with departments and agencies that don't have traditional CI authorities, if you will, to get the threat information out there and to help them build defensive programs. We've also partnered with the National Science Foundation this past year to roll out a program called Safeguarding Science, and this is really looking at how the Chinese intelligence services target our research communities. So getting more information out there about how those communities can put in place mitigations against those threats. That is one way that we do that collaboration.
When most people traditionally thought about counterintelligence, they weren't thinking about the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I think it is, and NIST,
Yeah.
or the National Science Foundation, or the Association of Universities. And yet you've brought all those together in this Safeguarding Science effort. Describe the toolkit that NCSC has developed on safeguarding science to help this wider array of actors understand counterintelligence threats and hopefully bring them to the attention of officials who can help them deal with them.
Yeah, so I'd say there's a website for this, so we would encourage people to go to it and sort of look at those resources and use them themselves. But it is broadly talking about the way the threat presents itself, the counterintelligence threat presents itself, and the types of mitigations organizations can put in place. So whether they are insider threat programs or supply chain programs, there are a wide range of tools that different organizations can use to help mitigate some of the threats emanating from these intel services.
Alan, let's bring that back to the Bureau. So let's say that you have one of these diverse threats, I'll call them. And I'm thinking here of something that is very publicly known, the Seeds case of probably more than 10 years ago now. So not an active case, but where the Chinese government, there's a longer story, but the Chinese government essentially was going after some multi-million-dollar seeds that had been developed, I think in Iowa, if I remember right. And that's not the kind of thing that your predecessors worried about the Soviets doing in the 1960s. How do you take what Mirriam described in terms of this big effort, in terms of getting everyone involved, and how does that focus in when it comes to actual cases?
Yeah, so Mirriam did a great job of explaining how NCSC puts together the strategy and helps push out information to the agencies. What the FBI does is we, with our partners, put those strategies into action. So I'll give you an example. We have, 3 years ago, we created the National Counterintelligence Task Force. That has grown to a task force of 50 agencies. All the three-letter agencies that you can think of, all the U.S. intelligence community agencies, and then a whole bunch that you wouldn't think would be in the counterintelligence fight with us. But it's important for us to bring these folks in and bring these agencies in because they have people and authorities and capabilities and data that we absolutely need to apply to the threats. So when we talk about a whole of government effort against us, we have to marshal a whole of government response to this. So, for example, you mentioned NIST or IRS or CBP, and most people would say, well, what does that have to do with counterintelligence? And to be honest, when we first brought some of these agencies in, we said, we really don't know what they're gonna do with us. But the threats from China, Russia, and Iran are so great that we need the resources of all these other agencies to help us. So we're bringing them in, they're getting the training, the access, they're in the briefings, and at some point, at multiple points over the last 3 years, they've all stepped up and said, you know what, we can help with that, or we've got a thing to solve that problem. And then we surge and we solve the problem and we move on and we share and we get better each iteration. So people should be rest assured that the stovepipes of old days, again, going back to the old days, are no longer there. There's a spirit of cooperation that I have not seen. It's just continued to grow in my 20-something years in the Bureau. And what the National Counterintelligence Task Force is going to do is put the national strategy into action in a way that's going to make us much more effective against the adversaries.
I think that's great to hear that cooperation is happening, but there's going to be some skepticism there because there's a history of a lot of culture clash. I'm not going to single out the FBI here, but when it comes to the FBI and the culture, the nature of the FBI cooperating, just sometimes coming in without having had a lot of those background briefings and saying, we're here, we're addressing this.
Yeah.
That didn't always go well. Now you're in an environment which is different, and you're saying, we're going to bring all these organizations in, we're going to have all these briefings. Counterintelligence is very sensitive. How do you have the briefings at such a level that they're not just interesting, but helpful to these entities, but they're not revealing things to people who aren't read into the most sensitive counterintelligence compartments?
Yeah. So we've had to go from, I'm the FBI, I'm here to help, and I'm taking over, to where we are today. You're exactly right. And that is, there's always a struggle between giving people information to help you do your job, yet at the same time putting that information at risk. And we are constantly talking about that every single day, how to protect sources and methods, yet still get the job done. And this is a cultural change that has taken a while In the FBI, 9/11 certainly drove that on the counterterrorism side. And on the counterintelligence side, we have had a slow buildup to it. Certainly the events around the 2016 elections have forced us together more over the past 5 or 6 years. But the only way that we can be effective against our adversaries is if we work together as partners. And the only way we can work together as partners is to have transparency into each other's business. And that means identifying pockets of information that we can all work on and know, and then also be grown up about it and say, hey, there's things that each of us does that we don't need to know about, and go into that relationship understanding where the boundaries are, and we're making some good things happen.
I think people can picture that here in Washington, right? You can picture, if not you, some of your colleagues getting together with security and counterintelligence officers or their equivalents at a number of departments and agencies and bureaus and other entities. A little bit harder in the wider national context, but Mirriam, up front, you talked about state and locals. And I think it's probably educational to talk a bit about that. The fact that the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, in cooperation with the FBI, is doing an unprecedented level of outreach to state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector entities. Talk through that. First of all, why, especially from the PRC threat point of view, and then what does that look like when you go out to Ottumwa, Iowa, or Lincoln, Nebraska, and you're talking to people about a topic that they've never really had to deal with at that tangible of a level before?
Yeah, good question. So on the state and local piece, why? Why are we doing outreach to state and local? Really, it's because we have seen China build closer relationships with state and local officials. This is something
Local U.S. officials.
with
right.
state and local U.S. officials. So these are relationships that they have nurtured over decades, but as China has seen that there's more bipartisan consensus against China these days, the relative autonomy that state and local leaders have from Washington presents an opportunity for them to be able to get voices to advance Beijing's position on the national stage, if you will. So a couple of ways that we have seen this. We've seen, for example, cases in which the Chinese government has been rather overt about it, in which the PRC has said, to a state or local official, I'm going to need you to speak out against U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, right? So a state or local official speaking out about a national level policy. We've also seen the PRC, again, overtly asking state legislators to introduce resolutions, praising China's COVID-19 response. We've also seen them state to certain states that they would withdraw their investment in that state if their governor visited Taiwan. So there are different areas where we see this threat play out, where they're using these relationships with state and local officials as an effort to shape U.S. policy and the U.S. discussion. What does engagement look like with state and local? So, we do not tell state and local officials to view all engagement with China with suspicion, okay? So to be clear, we recognize some of that is going to happen, that we are not saying to view it all blanket suspicion. What we are saying is that state and local officials ought to consider a number of things as they move forward in some of these engagements. So we've seen, for example, that China is really aggressively targeting U.S. data technology and talent. So we've asked state and local officials to consider, in this engagement, make sure there's transparency and accountability. And is the foreign entity, not just China, but China or the foreign entity with whom the state is engaging, are they able to siphon off data, technology, or talent as part of this effort? 2, are they able to develop some sort of leverage? Is the foreign entity able to develop leverage over that particular state or local official? And those are the kinds of things we want them to think about as they go into these things. And then thirdly, we think about If, for example, a foreign entity is seeking to gain access or do something near a sensitive facility in a particular state or location or a military base, we encourage them to work with all the relevant stakeholders to really think through that and have a good sense of what the threats are in that as it relates to that.
And those sensitive facilities sounds like are much more widely defined than they used to be. It's not
Yes.
military bases, U.S. federal government facilities.
Yes.
Sometimes it is seed factories or a company developing an emerging technology, working on semiconductors, issues like that. It's interesting, in your conversation there, you talked about two very different things to my ear. The first set of things you talked about is basically influence operations, that whether it's the PRC or someone else coming to, let's say, a prominent governor of an important state and saying, hey, we really want you to lobby the federal government about this, or we want you to say this publicly about what your state is going to do regarding Uyghurs or Taiwan or some other issue. That's influence. But then you transition seamlessly into, but they're also trying to get information. They're also trying to, whether it's intellectual property or state secrets, and I guess I mean that at the state level as well as the federal state secrets level. Those are two different things. So Alan, does the FBI look at those similarly, that they're of equal importance, or do you notice that you kind of have to allow some of the former because traditional diplomacy bleeds over into influence operations at some point, whereas stealing secrets is just stealing secrets?
Yeah, that's a good question, and this is a little bit of a gray area for us, where when does foreign influence cross the line into malign foreign influence or into an area where the FBI needs to get involved in? You know, and we have decided we are limiting our engagement in these foreign influence operations to those that are subversive, undeclared, coercive, or criminal. And if it hits one of those four pieces, subversive, undeclared, coercive, or criminal, the FBI will engage, and will either engage investigatively. Many times we'll do defensive briefings to the entity that's being targeted. And sometimes we even get their cooperation to work back against whatever Chinese or Russian or Iranian entity is doing the influence. This is all one big cloud of activity that China is doing. It's not okay, this is influence and this is IP theft. It could very well be the same thing where a delegation comes in and wants to give money to build factories, or they have mask diplomacy during the COVID pandemic where they give masks and then ask for favors back. But in the process of doing that, or for example, setting up a joint venture with a company, they may require that company to provide a lot of information about its proprietary information, about its network infrastructure. They may require that company to give access to their people. And all of that sort of easily blends from influence to economic espionage in a seamless and worrisome way.
One more question about the PRC before we go elsewhere. I anticipate there will be some other questions about the PRC later. But Mirriam, what Alan just talked about in terms of that gray area between, it's perfectly fine for anyone to come to a mayor or town manager or a governor, state legislator, say, we think the best policy would be this. That's not a problem. You defined it as if it's undeclared, if it's subversive, then it almost inherently becomes a problem. But if they're doing it out in the open, that's generally okay. When you're doing outreach, because that's the role primarily of NCSC, when you're doing outreach, how do you talk through that? Because you've got everything from First Amendment speech issues to laying the seeds for some kind of compromise and manipulation later, to the actual subversive, undeclared stuff that you would call Alan in on. How do you talk to people about that overall threat without crossing over into be afraid of everyone all the time?
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to describe the threat landscape, the way it can evolve, right? It's not going to look exactly the same every single time. We're just asking people to be vigilant about these engagements, to be looking out for some of these red flags that might be indicators of foreign intelligence activity.
And to be more vigilant towards some than others, is that fair to say?
I think not not like, towards Chinese delegations necessarily, but I think it's saying if you as a state or a local official are seeking to build a relationship with a foreign entity, any foreign entity, how do we think about that engagement in a way that really looks at what they're able to get from it or whether they're able to get leverage from us, have leverage over us as a result of it?
Right on. Alan, can you pick up on that?
I just want to hit one point that our concern is not with the people of China. I know this is something we say, but the threat that we face is from the Chinese Communist Party and the policies and practices that they've put in place. And we are not saying that everybody from China is bad and you shouldn't talk to anybody. What we are saying is that the government of China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, has a robust and systematic effort to influence us and target us and steal our critical technologies to make them better. And all we're asking people to do is when you engage with an entity from China, that you go into that engagement with your eyes wide open, understanding that there's more to it there potentially is more to it than what is actually being presented to you up front.
Let's broaden it out a little bit. Not to say that there aren't significant threats from Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and 180 plus others. But in recent years, the public statements coming out of the FBI and the NCSC have really focused on China and Russia. Almost always the same breath has both. Alan, first, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's easy to see that Russia's attention is so focused on that conflict that it's almost like we can not shift all of our attention, but maybe relatively put the balance more on some of these diverse threats from the PRC and other actors, because Russia is so occupied that the traditional spycraft is different now. Or you could look at it and say, Russia is on a war footing, and they are doing some things in counterintelligence that they've always been capable of, but now maybe we need to be more vigilant about what they could do. Without talking about specific cases under investigation, because I know you would if I didn't give you that caveat. That's just what you would do in this
I had
forum.
it right there.
But kind of characterize the Russian threat overall, especially how it compares to the PRC in that 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think right now we're in a unique time in history where, at least right now, Russia is very much focused on Ukraine, and they've got an international audience they're trying to address, and they've also got, probably more importantly, an internal audience that they're trying to address. So a lot of their efforts are to convince the internal audience inside Russia that the war is a just war and Putin is making the good decisions to bring the country into this war. Here on the ground in the United States, we have not really seen a change in their posture in terms of activities. They continue to have intelligence officers that are operational. They continue to come at us through cyber means. And they continue to be probably the adversary with the best overall tradecraft that we work up against. Broadly, the difference between Russia and China, it's a scale. I mean, China is literally an order of magnitude greater than the Russian threat in terms of number of people that are working the threat against us. And broadly, and this is very overgeneralizing, but the way that sometimes we describe it is that China's focus to increase their stature in the world is to make themselves better by either stealing from others or creating policies in other countries that help China. Russia is trying to make themselves relatively better by undercutting others. So if Russia knocks us down relative, they're higher. So you see a lot of their effort being targeted on influence operations and creating divisive or fostering divisiveness between racial parties, for example, or some controversial things for driving wedges between pockets of America. So broadly speaking, probably over broadly, Russia's tendency is to knock us down. China is to bring themselves up.
And traditionally, the FBI has worked with many foreign partners on specific counterintelligence threats as they come up. It makes me wonder about NCSC. Is there an international role working with liaison partners in the intelligence context, law enforcement partners? Is that something that NCSC gets involved in, or do you defer to the elements that are more operational to do that?
No, I mean, we do some engagement with foreign partners, select foreign partners that have counterparts that work similar issues. I think we often do it in partnership with FBI or other agencies that are relevant, and we talk about the types of things that we're doing, how we're thinking about the threat, what kinds of strategies we're putting in place, and then how we do public or private sector outreach.
I want to talk a little bit about, as people start to formulate questions in your head, you get a sense of where we're going now. I want to talk a little bit about how you do this from an organizational point of view, because we are at a university and there are students who are looking for employment at some point in the future. And this is a, I don't know, growth industry, I think it's fair to say. Counterintelligence
Yes.
is hiring.
Yes.
National security in general is hiring, but counterintelligence is certainly hiring. We're at the place now where you are out there publicly talking about getting a job in counterintelligence, which again, didn't used to be a thing a long time ago, and helping people with the clearance process. Now, it is called the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. You have a security component which helps the whole US government handle security threats to the government, which can involve clearances and getting people cleared. So what's your advice to people looking to enter the counterintelligence field? What should they be thinking about in terms of security, and what is it that you're looking for in terms of people who want to enter this?
Yes. First of all, this is definitely a growth industry. I mean, I think the way we see the counterintelligence threat landscape changing, the way there are more actors and more targets and more capabilities, there will be more work to come, and we need good people, maybe some of you here in the audience, to join us in that space. I mean, I think when we look for people to join our ranks, we're really looking for people who are critical thinkers, good writers, people who have a good sense of identifying what sorts of problems there are on the geopolitical landscape and identifying some potential mitigations for them. In the security clearance process, I mean, we're continuing to work broadly on security clearance policy modernization. That is something that NCSC, in partnership with other departments and agencies, are working on, and we do hope that that will move more smoothly in the coming years.
Different agencies and departments involved in this have different clearance requirements and different processes. For incoming candidates even, just on the question of use of illicit drugs. Is that something that you help to coordinate and integrate, or do you really leave that up to each entity to do, as long as you're aware of them at that level?
Well, there is some broader work happening in our space on this as well. I would point out that there is still a distinction between what the federal policy is related to illicit drugs. And so that certainly impacts or has an impact on clearance processes.
Sure. Let's talk about the FBI more specifically. You're at about the 3-year mark as Assistant Director of CI. So you have a pretty good sense now of what skill set makes a good counterintelligence officer. Is this something you're looking for people with a very specific background coming in, or do you agree with Mirriam that critical thinking and those kinds of things are just as important?
Yeah, so I was actually asked this question recently, and I think there's really two critical skills to being a good FBI counterintelligence officer. One is just a core function of being an FBI agent. You have to be able to talk to people and have good communication skills. We are only as good as our ability to talk to people and to get them to tell us things and have a normal conversation, hopefully like this is a normal conversation. We are only as good as our ability to communicate. And at our core, I need people who can talk to everybody that we have to interact with. And two, probably what I value the most, aside from the normal core abilities of an agent, is creativity. And the reason I value that is because just like we now have been around, the Counterintelligence Division has been an entity in the FBI for 83 years now. Our adversaries have been looking at us for 80-something years. And in many cases, they know how we've acted in the past, how we're going to act in the future, the types of questions we ask better than we know ourselves. So I need people to come in and be creative about the job, accomplish the same tasks, but do it in a different way than perhaps it was done last year or 5 years or 10 years ago. And that requires us to know our history, but also at the same time to really try and figure out ways to come up with creative and impactful operations that inflicts the most cost and consequences on the adversaries. So communications and creativity.
Sure. Please make your way up to the microphones if you have questions while I ask another one of our guests here. We've talked about a lot of different organizations, private sector, public sector, federal, state, local, tribal. I don't think we've said the word Congress yet. And that's traditionally an area that Congress was not as heavily involved in as some other parts of intelligence and national security. And I'm just wondering if you can characterize the overall relationship, both in terms of support for what NCSC does and enough awareness of what the counterintelligence environment is to be helpful without getting so involved that it becomes, in a sense, an attempt to micromanage through oversight. Could you describe the relationship with Congress overall?
Sure. I mean, you may be tracking that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence recently did an audit on the CI community and organizationally, NCSC specifically. As part of it, they took into consideration the changing landscape that we've talked about today and whether counterintelligence for the U.S. government is postured correctly to address those threats. They've identified a number of areas, made recommendations where I think potentially new authorities would be needed or we'd need to work in partnership to resource certain things. We work closely with our overseers and certainly are looking forward to implementing some of the recommendations that they've highlighted in that report.
Whether it's Congress or I'll give you one that's even easier, the media, when it comes to the FBI perspective, again, a lot of institutional history dealing with both.
Yep.
In this new threat environment we've described, do you think that the media and Congress have a full enough understanding of the expanded threat environment to contribute to the national effort when it comes to counterintelligence?
So I think, much like I said, where we're making a big push to communicate with academia and industry, we are trying to be more transparent also with our overseers in Congress and with the media. So in the past 3-5 years, we have probably done more media engagements, proactive media engagements, than we have in probably the 10 years before that. And it's a reflection that for us to get our job done, we need the cooperation of the American people, and they're only going to have that if they have the understanding of what the threats are and why the FBI is involved. And they're only going to get that if they hear from us either through the media, through our own outreach, or maybe even members of Congress speaking on our behalf and supporting us with resources and money at each year.
Right on. We're going to take some questions now. Please remember the guidance, introduce yourself if you will, and keep your questions focused on the counterintelligence channel that we're in. We'll start here.
Speaking of the media, Jerry Dunleavy with the Washington Examiner. I was really struck by Ms. MacIntyre and Mr. Kohler about what you said about the importance of educating the American public about these influence operations. I was wondering if the instance where former intelligence officers signed a letter alleging that the Hunter Biden laptop was an influence operation or was a signal of Russian involvement, if that sort of thing by your former colleagues, if that would impact at all the trust that you need when briefing the American public. And Mr. Priess is one of the signers of it. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, that's not related to the counterintelligence of foreign actors, so I think we'll probably move on unless you want to take it, Alan.
No,
Nope,
good.
We're good. Please go ahead.
So in the past, human intelligence has been one of the core, or arguably the most important domain in terms of counterintelligence, but in recent years, there's been a growing importance in cyber operations. So to this day, is human intelligence still the most important domain, and if so, will it remain so, in your opinion?
This is a good one because it gets to the big issue of the diversity of the threat, but it also gets to the things in your mind that you won't give us details on, but the specific human and cyber issues. So characterize that overall relationship, and then overall, we haven't talked about cyber specifically very much, so any thoughts either one of you have on cyber?
That is a very good question. I'll put it this way. Humans is not going away, right? Human will continue to be important because it can give us insights that we may not be able to get through other collection means. That said, I think the importance of the various types of ways an intelligence agency can collect information and bring that together is really where you get the value add.
Yeah, so for me, human is never going to go away. Behind every operation is a person who's providing direction, control, and funding. Cyber is a vector that adversaries use, just like they use delegations and intelligence officers and many other things that they do to come after us and our valued objects. So again, it's very much my answer to almost everything is it's not an either or, it's a both. And on any given day, cyber is going to be the worst aspect of it, and human's going to be the worst aspect of it. But now we're in a world where they will both always exist.
We are in a world where some people, and I'm thinking here of some members of Congress, have fallen in love with cyber as an issue to really focus on.
Yeah.
And I think your message is an interesting one, which is if you're worried about the cyber threat from foreign intelligence services and bad actors, you need to be worried about human because they're linked. And if you're worried about human, you actually have to be concerned about cyber too. It really does.
It's a
involve
spectrum.
both.
So if you think of someone being, if you go back to the old days where someone would try and meet you in a bar and chat you up and find out about what you're doing. Well, now they can find your profile on social media and connect with you, and then meet you in person, and then send you an email with a malware on it and get into your computer. So is that a human operation or is that a cyber operation? The answer is it's both. So it's never an either or. It's just a blend, and where you are on that spectrum is sort of how we determine which tools we use to get in the way of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Michael. My question is, how often are counterintelligence types of operations conducted abroad, but more in the sense of, is a potential of an overseas posting a consideration someone looking at potentially going into this field should consider?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know exactly how many, maybe I'll give you a generic answer. The answer is yes. The FBI has FBI agents in 90 plus countries around the world. And my division runs operations inside the United States and overseas. And however many I have at any given time, I couldn't tell you, but we absolutely do. Even though we have people in 93 countries, not many people actually get out to do an overseas posting. But certainly, if you are coming into the Bureau with overseas experience, language experience, you've done a study abroad, that is a helpful thing because it knows, for us, we know that you have experience working overseas, engaging with other cultures, and bringing that into the FBI would be a good thing.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I'd also add just one more thing. I think, to note, other departments and agencies that make up the intelligence community also have many positions overseas, of which some of them may be counterintelligence focused. So I think there are opportunities across the board
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
And I'll add one more thing that from my experience, and maybe this reflects both of yours, is people don't always do counterintelligence for their entire
Yes.
career. You might be working at the DIA on something else, and suddenly you find yourself helping run the NCSC. It's maybe that intellectual curiosity, the creativity, the critical thinking that you talked about that are important, and those are true for many kinds of intelligence jobs. They happen to be specifically very well suited for counterintelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, good evening. My name's Ann Finley. Earlier we talked about a best practice, or in my opinion, best practice, the concept of bringing other organizations into a better situation awareness of a situation, of a counterintelligence issue. Is there any particular lesson learned that you think the industry has also learned over time? Or another best practice?
About in the counterintelligence world?
Yes, sir.
Oh. This we could take all night on this one. So for me, I think the advice that I give to folks that work for me is you're only limited by your imagination. And whatever you can envision, you can do, or you should do. And that we should be doing things in the FBI against our adversaries that Hollywood wants to make movies about, right? We need to be that creative. So what I in terms of a best practice, again, just coming off the creativity piece, it's really encouraging people to aspire for greatness, and don't be settled on going after, for example, if you have a one intelligence officer or one person who's stealing intellectual property, it's not enough just to take care of that person, kick him out, deny his visa, PNG him. We have to work higher and have a much broader impact. So a best practice that makes us effective is really aspiring, set your goal very high, and then only then are you going to achieve a goal that high. If you just continue to look here and you're happy with picking off the low-level fruit, you're not going to do the things that we need to do, that the country needs us to do.
And I think when you ask a question about best practices at organizations that they can implement, there are a couple of things that we've thought about or discussed with some of these private sector entities. Things like, how do you look at the risk that an organization faces across an entire enterprise? So thinking about risks in HR, risks in supply chain, all of that. There are efforts or things we've talked about as far as like creating insider threat programs, but not just insider threat programs like you're going to be a spy and I'm concerned about you sharing our intellectual property, but really like, workforce wellness issues, right? Mental health issues, ensuring that you don't have an active shooter incident as well. These are the types of things that we have shared with private sector partners that I think has been helpful as far as thinking about how you build an enterprise-wide, organizational-wide program.
Yeah, for sure. Well, simply said, happy people don't spy.
Yes, there you go.
And if you can keep your workforce energized, appreciated, and happy, you're gonna reduce that insider threat greatly.
Yeah.
That's a good bumper sticker. You have that on
Yeah.
your car?
It's a tattoo on my arm.
So to sum
We
it
don't
up,
need to see it.
take care of your people and aspire to be better.
Right.
There
Thank
go.
you.
There we go. The bad news is that we're getting close to time. The good news is that there's a reception afterwards, so your additional questions, if you don't get a chance to ask them, we can take that to our guests immediately afterward. The good news is, see, I did good, bad, good. The good news is we have time for at least one more, so please go ahead and ask your question here, and then we might need to leave some time for closing remarks.
Yes, hi, my name is Hayden Jacobs. The question I want to pose to you all is the role of the average citizen in counterintelligence. So what can citizens in their limited capacities do to help prevent a cybersecurity threat? Is it simply just being informed about the issues, or is there something more that the average citizen can do?
Yeah, you try it. I'll jump in.
Yeah, there's so many things to say. Why don't I, because top of mind is your reference to like social media and blended operations earlier. I mean, I think one thing we can think about as the average citizen is thinking about the types of information we put out about ourselves on social media, right? Because part of this involves all of us making ourselves a harder target. We recognize we are going to live lives that are also engaged on social media. So it's just thinking about what kind of information are we putting out there? How do we make ourselves a hard target to a foreign intelligence service that might be seeking to target me or the information I have access to? And then how can I engage with people who want to just friend me, that are complete strangers? Like, you have to determine for yourself if that is a risk you are willing to take, or if you can identify additional information about a stranger's company that they are purportedly representing.
Yeah, I would just dovetail into that. On the cyber side, that's not my area of expertise, but if you exercise standard cyber hygiene, you're going to eliminate 95% of the problems that you potentially face. Two-factor authentication, change your password regularly, do your regular updates. You're going to be much better off. And don't click on links. Yeah, there you go. Think before you link.
Yeah.
From a counterintelligence perspective, my advice would be to trust your instincts. You'll know if you are working in an industry where you have sign a non-disclosure agreement and you're not allowed to talk about something outside your company, or you have a security clearance and you know these are the boundaries of what I can talk about and what I can't. And if you have somebody probing those areas, that's something you need to worry about, and that's something you need to talk about. And tell your security officer, tell an FBI agent, police officer, whoever it needs to be, and get it into the system where we can address it. We can only do something about it if we know about it. So the old adage, if you see something, say something. In the counterintelligence world, we absolutely need people to sort of have their spidey senses up, know what's weird, and then not be afraid to say something about it.
Great advice. And I got to say, crazy idea here. You should make like a TikTok about that on your government device and show that around. That would be great.
Yeah.
Too soon.
Why haven't we done that?
We are gonna close with the question from
So-
our YouTube audience, voiced by Larry Pfeiffer.
Yeah, so I apologize. I think I was giving bad hand signals to you, David. I was just trying to let you know we had a YouTube question earlier. So we may actually have time for one more question after me if there is somebody who was in line and would like to come. I think we've still got a little bit of time. I apologize. YouTube question comes from a Martine Reed. Interesting question. It's talking about the concerns that exist today in the United States with domestic groups, bad actors. You know, we have white supremacist groups, we have other racist groups, we have terrorist groups that exist within the United States. Can you speak to how much foreign intelligence services may be trying to influence them, infiltrate them, work with them, fund them, et cetera? And I know this can be sensitive because if you look at our history, this was an issue. You know, you go back to the 1960s and the 50s. You know, there's a lot of history about supposed infiltration of domestic groups. So I'm just curious, and I think Martine is curious, if you can address that issue from both an NCSC strategic perspective as well as perhaps what you're seeing on the ground from the FBI.
Maybe I'll start from a strategic perspective and then over to Alan. You know, one of the ways that we have that we typically characterize the threat landscape is that we see more actors in this space. We define it as a bunch of mores really quickly. More actors, more targets, more capabilities, more threat vectors, more collaboration between intelligence services.
That's a much
and more
longer
data.
bumper sticker,
Very
but it
long.
still works.
Happy people don't spy, much pithier. But all that to say, you know, as we look at that landscape, one of the things we talk about on the more actors front is that we do see more non-state actors, ideologically motivated groups operating in a way that could be construed as intelligence activities or involved in that CI landscape.
Yeah, I think I would limit my comments to the assessment that the intelligence community put out in 2017, talking about how Russia tried to sow discord inside the United States by driving wedges between certain social groups. That document still stands. It's still very accurate. And I think I'd leave it at that.
Excellent. So we will do one more question in the room. Congratulations. Please let us know who you are and what you'd like to hear.
Sure, thank you. When it comes to intelligence and counterintelligence on the world stage, is the U.S. at an inherent disadvantage against authoritarian regimes that can act swiftly and unilaterally without worrying about things like due process or human rights?
Yep.
Is it, let me phrase it in a slightly different way. Is it a vulnerability that perhaps authoritarian regimes don't have? You say yes. Is it also a strength, though, because of what we can bring to the table in terms of this whole of government effort we talked about?
I think it's a strength. I mean, yes, that's my gut reaction is
Yeah.
yep. But I think it is a strength because you're able to bring together different viewpoints that actually strengthen a response. And that's something that you'd be less likely to see in an authoritarian system.
Yeah, I think I go back to the comments that we both said throughout. Partnerships are everything, and you can be an authoritarian regime and sort of bully your way to action. But if you really want to gather international support or support inside your government to work collectively against a threat, people have to have confidence in you that you play by the rules. They know what the rules are, and you're consistent. And for all of our faults inside the U.S. government, we are rule followers. We have rules for everything, and We are predictable, and that inspires confidence in our partners, and hopefully fear in our adversaries, that they know we're going to play by rules and we're still going to beat them even though they don't play by the same rules.
Final question for both of you before closing remarks. If people want to find out more about the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, or about the Counterintelligence Division, not historically the most public division at FBI, what are the best places for them to go?
You can find us on our website. If you look up NCSC, we are National Counterintelligence and Security Center, because there is a UK NCSC, so to be clear. Look us up, and you can connect with us there. We also have a Twitter account, so NCSC.gov. Follow us.
Yeah, for the FBI, FBI.gov, and there's a What We Do link. Click on that and hit the counterintelligence button, and you'll learn a lot about the division and what we do.
We appreciate it. Thank you. Larry, over to you.
So speaking of authoritarian governments, I think there was a headline this morning that Vladimir Putin met with the FSB, which is his foreign intelligence and counterintelligence service, and he was berating them a bit this morning about the level of their performance in recent times. And so I would imagine that didn't necessarily inspire a high level of confidence in his workforce in getting their job done. The only other thing I would note is there's a woman named Caroline on the YouTube channel who says, "I'm available to work, take me." So I think you must have
Love it.
accomplished something tonight.
we got
So,
one.
Yeah.
thank you to Mirriam. Thank you to Alan for taking the time to come and visit with us and visit with you and answer your questions. We're going to have plenty of time afterwards in the reception to chat with them one-on-one if you'd like. Thanks you to the Schar School for hosting the Hayden Center, and thank you for General Hayden for all the inspiration you give us every day. With that, I would just ask the audience to please exit to the multipurpose room across the foyer. I know you're eager to come talk to the guys right now, but probably be better to get over in the room, and then we'll join you over there in just a second. Thank you very much.